when Roy Callister died in the back room of his own shoe repair shop on a Tuesday morning in late March, his two children divided what he had left behind in 11 days. The house on Birch Street went first. Gordon had a real estate contact, a woman in a gray blazer who walked through rooms with a clipboard while Roy's reading glasses still sat folded on the kitchen table. The savings account came next, just under $21,000 after Gordon claimed executors' fees and what he called the cost of administration. He kept the truck. He kept the tools from the garage, sold them through an online listing before Marlene even knew they were gone. What Gordon did not want was the shop. It sat on the end of Main Street in Grenville like something the town had been meaning to get around to for years. A narrow brick building with a hand-painted sign above the door. Callister's Shoe Repair, Est, 1984. The letters faded to the color of old cream. The front window had a crack sealed with clear tape. The back room smelled of leather and glue and 40 years of the same man doing the same work without complaint. "It's not worth the property tax," Gordon said, dropping the key on the counter beside a cardboard box. "I talked to a guy, maybe $400 for the equipment if you can find someone to haul it. The lease runs out in April anyway." Marlene picked up the key. It was worn smooth at the bow, warm from Gordon's hand, and on the grip someone had wrapped a strip of electrical tape a long time ago, gone stiff and dark with age. "April is 3 weeks away," she said. "I know when April is." He pressed the tape flat on the box with his thumb and did not look up. "I'm not trying to make this harder. I'm the one who handled all of it. Somebody had to." His wife, Deborah, had already claimed the oak china cabinet from the dining room and a set of linen their mother had brought from her own mother's house. The rest, Deborah said, wasn't worth renting a van for. Marlene watched them go. She had $214 in her account and an apartment in Hamilton, 4 hours west, above a dry cleaner that left everything smelling faintly of solvent. The rent was due in 12 days. Before that had been a hospital in Burlington, where she had worked as a registered nurse for 19 years, until the night 16 months ago when a 7-year-old boy came into the pediatric ward, and she could not save him, and she drove home that night, and handed in her badge the following morning, and had not worked a single shift since. She had not told her father any of that. She had told the nursing board, the HR department, the one therapist she had seen twice before she stopped going. She had not told Roy. Every time he called she said she was fine, between things, taking some time. He never pushed. He had a way of listening to a silence that made you feel he already understood what was inside it. It was a gray Thursday when she finally drove out to Grenville to empty the shop and see what the salvage company would take. She parked on the street and sat in her car for a few minutes before she could make herself go in. The key turned easily, as if it had been used recently. The bell above the door gave one flat note, and then the smell reached her. Leather conditioner, hide glue, the dry papery scent of old insoles, and underneath all of it something that was simply Roy. The particular smell of a person who has worked in one place long enough to become part of it. She stood in the doorway and breathed it and could not move. The shop was exactly as he had left it. 2 wooden chairs along the wall for customers. A low counter with an ancient cash register that hadn't been used in years. Roy had switched to a cash tin sometime in the 90s and never gone back. Behind the counter, the workbench, the awls and lasts and rolls of thread arranged on pegboard with the quiet order of a man who knew where every tool was in the dark. And on the bench, the last job he had ever taken in. A woman's brown Oxford, one heel replaced, the other still waiting. He had not finished it. Marlene stood at the counter for a long time with her hand resting on the wood and felt the groove worn into the edge by 40 years of customers resting their arms there. Then she went to the back room because the salvage company opened at 9, and she had less than an hour. The back room was narrow, steel shelving on 2 walls, mostly bare, a filing cabinet in the corner, and against the back wall a large wooden storage cabinet, floor to ceiling, the kind built to last. Roy had made it himself from lumber he bought at the mill the year he opened. She started pulling shelves out, boxes of old receipts, a tin of brass eyelets, bundles of leather offcuts bound with twine. She was reaching toward the bottom shelf when her knuckles knocked against something that sounded wrong. Not the hollow sound of empty shelving, a different sound, lower. She stopped. She had spent 19 years in a profession that trained you to notice what did not fit, the wrong rhythm, the wrong color, the wrong sound. She cleared the bottom shelf and found the panel. It was cut flush to the back of the cabinet, painted the same color as the rest, secured with 2 small barrel bolts painted to disappear, invisible, unless you were on your hands and knees looking for it, which she was now. She worked the bolts with her thumbnail. They gave with a dry click. The panel swung inward on a hinge. Behind it, set into a cavity between the cabinet and the brick wall, was a wooden box about the size of a storage crate, lined with a folded wool blanket, and inside it, arranged with a care that told you immediately that none of this had been thrown in. 4 cloth-bound ledgers, their spines soft from years of handling. A tobacco tin, the lid pressed on tight, heavier than it should be. A bundle of envelopes tied with kitchen string, the paper at the bottom gone the color of old tea. A folded legal document creased through the middle, with a lawyer's name printed on the envelope, Carrington and Associates, Grenville, on. And underneath everything, lying flat against the wool, a plain white envelope with one word written on it in blue ink, in a handwriting she had known since before she could read. Marlene. Her hands were not steady when she lifted it out. Stay with us. Because what Roy Callister kept behind that cabinet is about to come up into the light, and none of it is what either of his children thought he was. She opened the ledgers first because she needed to understand before she could read a letter. The entries started 31 years ago, each one dated, each one the same shape, a name, an age, a shoe size, and a note. Sept 4. Cody Pelletier, age 7, size 2Y, left boots at his door before school. The sole on his right one was worn through to the sock. He would have walked the whole winter on that. She turned the page. Oct 12, twin girls, age 9, size 4Y each, mother working nights at the cannery. Bought the boots from my supplier at cost and left them on the mat. No note, they don't need to know who. She kept turning. Hundreds of entries. Thousands, maybe, when she let herself do the arithmetic. 31 years, a new school year every September. And sometimes winter entries, sometimes spring, whenever someone came into the shop, wearing something that told Roy what they needed and could not ask for. He had been running a shoe repair shop. He had also, it turned out, been running something else entirely. Something with no sign on the door and no record anywhere, except in 4 cloth ledgers behind a hidden panel that nobody had ever been meant to find until now. She opened the tobacco tin. It was full of bills, 5s and 10s and 20s, soft from handling, and a slip of paper folded on top in Roy's handwriting, for the next pair so the next kid doesn't walk on cold ground. She did not yet know where the money came from. She would learn later that there had been a mason jar on the counter for 30 years, beside the cash tin, with a hand-lettered label that read for the kids. Customers dropped their change in it. Some left bills. Roy never asked and never explained, and nobody who had ever been in the shop had thought to question it, because that was simply Roy. The way some things about a person become so much a part of them they stop being remarkable. She picked up the legal document. Inside was a property deed. The shop building itself, Lot 14 on Main Street, purchased outright 11 years ago for $62,000. The buyer's name was Roy Douglas Callister. Marlene sat back on her heels. She had always assumed he rented. He had never said otherwise. She had never thought to ask. Clipped below the deed was a trust document and a handwritten note at the bottom in Roy's careful print. Building held in trust for the purpose outlined. C. Carrington, reterms. Not to be sold. Not ever. She stared at that last line for a long while. Then she opened her father's letter. If you're still here with Marlene on that back room floor, do us a favor and hit subscribe. Because what Roy wrote in that letter is the part of this story that changes everything, and the person who's going to try to take it all apart is about to call her phone. The letter was 3 pages, written on the back of old shop paper, the kind Roy had used for estimates since before Marlene was born. The handwriting was even at the top and looser by the 3rd page. The way a person's hand goes when they have been sitting still for a long time, and the cold has started to find the joints. Dear Marlene, if you found the box, then I'm gone, and you're on the floor of my back room wondering what on earth your old man was up to. That's a fair thing to wonder. I should have told you years ago, and I kept not doing it, because every time I tried it came out sounding either foolish or like I was looking for a pat on the back, and the whole point was that it was never about that. I put it where only someone willing to do the hard, unglamorous work of emptying the place would ever find it. If that's you, then you're the one I meant it for. You always were. I just couldn't say that to your face without it coming out wrong. There's something I need to tell you before the rest of it. I know about the hospital. Not the details. Gordon mentioned you'd left nursing, said you were taking time, but I could hear it in your voice every time you called. 19 years is not something you walk away from unless something happened that broke part of you, and I didn't push because I know you, and pushing would have sent you further away. But I want you to understand that whatever you're carrying about that, whatever you think it says about who you are, it doesn't say what you think it does. I know that sound. I made it myself once. She stopped reading. She made herself breathe. 31 years ago, the letter continued. A boy came into the shop in October. He was 8 years old. His mother brought him in for a resole on his winter boots. When I took them off to measure the job, I saw his socks. There were none. He'd been stuffing newspaper inside the boots to fill the gap. I gave him a pair from the shelf, size 6, that had been unclaimed for 2 months, and his mother tried to pay me, and I said they'd been sitting there taking up space, and I was glad to be rid of them. She knew I was lying. She thanked me anyway. They walked out, and I locked the door, and I sat on that bench for a long time, thinking about how many children in this town I had simply not been paying attention to. That was the first entry in the first ledger. I started paying attention after that. 31 years of paying attention. The building is yours. Paid off 11 years ago, because I knew the day the shop was worth something to a developer was the day someone would want to take it from what it was for. The trust holds it for one purpose only: shoes for any child in this county who needs them. In perpetuity. I chose that word on purpose. I want it to outlast all of us. I'm asking you to keep it going. Not because you owe me anything. Because you lost something you loved, and you've been telling yourself it makes you less than you were. And I want you to find out what I found out. That the work itself is the thing that holds you up. Not the recognition. Not the outcome. The work. I was never good at saying I was proud of you. Every time I tried, it came out too much or not enough, and so I stopped trying. So I'm telling the paper instead. I am proud of you. I always was, and I'm sorry I was better at fixing other people's shoes than saying that to your face. She set the letter down in her lap and pressed her palms flat against the cold concrete floor. The same floor she had sat on as a girl waiting for her father to close up, and she cried the way she had not let herself cry in 16 months, not quietly, not composed, but from somewhere that had been sealed since the night she drove home from the hospital and could not go back. Her phone rang at 9:10. Gordon. I got a call this morning, he said, the careful tone of someone who has already made up his mind. Development company, they're doing a commercial strip out on the Route 7 corridor, and they want Main Street properties for the anchor end. They offered $180,000 for Dad's building. She said nothing. You hear me? $180 for that place. If Dad actually owned the building and it wasn't in the estate disclosure, that's something we need to correct. I'm calling a lawyer today. Across the road through the front window, a light was on in the hardware store. It's in a trust, Marlene said. Talk to Carrington and Associates. He set it up 11 years ago. What kind of trust? Dad fixed shoes, Marlene. He didn't set up trusts. And hiding a deed under the floorboards, that's not normal. Toward the end, he wasn't. He measured children's feet, she said. Her voice was level. It was the voice she had used on difficult nights in the ward, when someone needed to stop panicking and start thinking. For 31 years, quietly, with no one watching, he kept records of every child in this county who came in here with worn soles, and he made them a pair and left it at their door and never told a soul. That's not decline, Gordon. That's the whole point of the man. The line went quiet. We're not done with this, he said. No, Marlene said, we're not. She hung up. Her hand was steady. Outside, the light across the road went off and the hardware store door opened, and a man came out wiping his hands on a rag, looking at her car and then at the dark shop windows. His name was Vince Okafor. He had run the hardware store across from Roy for 22 years. He let himself in. He had a key, and when he found Marlene on the back room floor surrounded by ledgers, his face went through something she recognized as relief. I wondered which of you would come, he said. He sat in the customer chair and told her how Roy had kept the shop running well past the point his hands allowed because closing it meant the jar disappeared, and the jar meant the shoes. How Vince had shoveled the front walk every winter for 3 years after Roy's back gave out. How the previous September, 2 weeks before Roy died, he had sat in that same chair and carefully written the last entry in the fourth ledger. A girl named Priya, age 6, ballet flats for the school concert, left on the family's doorstep the night before the show. He had never spoken about it to anyone. He had never gone to the newspaper. On the few occasions when a family figured out who had left the shoes, he'd told Roy, and Roy had simply said the supplier had given him extras, and he'd had to put them somewhere. He'd told me once, Vince said, the hardest part wasn't making the shoes, it was after. He'd leave a pair at someone's door and spend the next month wondering if the fit was right, if they'd been worn, if it had mattered, because there was no way to know. He did it all in the dark and had to be all right with that. A woman came later that afternoon. Her name was Bet Forrest, 72, silver-haired, who had worked the front counter at Callister's for 20 years, before arthritis took her hands. She walked in and stopped in the doorway of the back room, looked at the ledgers spread on the floor, and pressed her lips together hard. I knew all of it, she said, sitting across from Marlene on an upturned crate. Every September I'd watch him go quiet around the third week of August. That was measuring week. He'd find reasons to talk to teachers, to the church ladies running the back-to-school drive, to anyone who might know which children were coming in September without what they needed. He never asked directly. He just listened the way he always listened, until he knew enough. Then he made the shoes. How many? Marlene asked. Bet looked at the ledgers. Over 1,000 entries in 31 years, she said quietly. Some single children, some whole families. She shook her head. He hated the word charity, absolutely hated it. Said charity was when you made someone feel small for needing something, and he wasn't interested in that. He was just interested in the shoes. That evening people came, not for anything announced. Word had moved through Grenville the way it moves in small towns. By noon everyone knew that Roy Callister's daughter was at the shop, and the ledgers were out. A woman came with her teenage son. She had grown up in Grenville, moved away for work, driven 3 hours back that day. In 2001 she had been a single mother, working 2 jobs, and her son started grade 1 in shoes 2 sizes too small because she couldn't get to the store until payday, and payday was 10 days away. The morning of the first day of school there was a box on her step. 2 pairs, one for him, one in the next size up for when he grew, no note. She had never known who until today. The son was 18 and tall and bored in the way teenagers are bored when their parents are emotional. But when Marlene showed him the entry, his name, his size, that September date, he stood very still and read it twice. A man came who had worked for Roy for 6 months in the early 90s. Just out of a difficult stretch he did not name, and Roy had paid him fairly and asked him nothing about where he'd been. When things steadied, the man had moved to Barrie and made a life. He had written Roy a letter once. He had assumed it was lost. Marlene found it that night in the bundle of envelopes, third from the top, opened and refolded. Roy had kept everyone. The letter from Gordon's lawyer arrived that Friday. It challenged the trust on the grounds of diminished capacity, the hidden accounts, the concealed deed, Roy's years of secrecy, a pattern of conduct, the letter said, inconsistent with rational estate management. Marlene read it standing at the workbench. Then she called Carrington and Associates. The lawyer who answered had worked with Roy for 11 years. Her name was Priya Carrington, and her voice was measured and very calm. Your father came to us 11 years ago and set up an irrevocable trust, she said. You are the named trustee. The building and the accumulated funds, $43,000, are designated for one purpose, the provision of footwear to children in need in this county in perpetuity. The trust is airtight. We drafted it specifically to withstand a capacity challenge. Your father told me directly that a family member who valued property over purpose would come eventually, and he wanted everything in order before that day. A pause. He visited our office every year for 11 years. His last visit was 8 weeks before he died. He was fully lucid and very clear about what he wanted. He also left a note in the file to be read to you if this ever happened. What does it say? It says, she'll think she doesn't deserve this. Tell her the shoes don't care what she thinks she deserves. Tell her to just make the pair. Marlene closed her eyes and held the phone and did not speak for a moment, and Priya, who had clearly read the whole file, did not rush her. The hearing was held at the county courthouse. Not a trial, just a review requested by Gordon's lawyer. But the rows behind the two tables were full. Bet sat upright with her hands folded. Vince came in a clean jacket. The woman with the teenage son came. The man from Barrie drove 4 hours. A teacher came. A woman in her late 30s who said Roy Callister had left winter boots at her family's door in 1997 when she was 9 years old, and that she had become a teacher because of a man who had shown her, without ever meeting her, that someone in the town she grew up in had noticed her. Gordon's lawyer made his argument. Hidden assets, undisclosed property, irrational conduct, a man who concealed decades of activity from his own family. The judge allowed the room to speak. One after another they stood, not to argue about deeds or capacity, to talk about a man who had paid attention to what children needed and done something about it quietly, for 31 years, with no audience and no acknowledgement and no record except the one he kept for himself. Gordon sat at the other table and did not look at his lawyer. He looked at the faces one after another, describing a father he had grown up beside and never known. The challenge was dismissed before noon. The trust was valid. Marlene was the sole trustee. The building was not for sale. By May, the shop was a different place. The cracked front window was replaced with clean glass that let the morning light pour across the old floor. Vince's nephew ran new wiring. Bet came 2 afternoons a week and ran the front counter with the efficiency of a woman who had done it for 20 years and had simply paused. A retired cobbler from the next town over came in on Saturdays and worked the bench alongside Marlene, teaching her small things her father had never thought to show her. The way you read a soul to know what it will do in 6 months. The way you pull a welt straight before the glue set. A chain of knowledge running back through 50 years of hands. Marlene put the ledgers on a shelf behind the counter where anyone who asked could read them. She framed the note from the tobacco tin and hung it on the wall beside the mason jar, which she filled and set back in its place by the register the words, "For the kids," in Roy's handwriting, facing the door. On the morning she reopened, Gordon came. He stood on the pavement looking at the sign and then at her. No tie, no briefcase. Deborah wasn't with him. He looked older than he had at the courthouse, which had been only 3 weeks before. "Can I come in?" he said. She held the door. He walked the length of the shop slowly, the way someone walks when they are actually looking and not just moving through. He stopped at the ledgers. He read one entry, then another, and his jaw was working at something he wasn't ready to say yet. "I found something last night," he said finally, "in the files I took from the house. A bank statement from an account I didn't know existed. He'd been savings into it since 1993. For the trust." He reached into his coat and took out a check. "The house sale settled. After the mortgage and my costs, my share came to about $32,000. I put half toward the trust. I know it doesn't fix 30 years of not knowing him. I know that." Marlene took the check. She looked at it for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. He didn't try to hug her and she didn't reach for him, and that was all right. There was time for the rest of it later, or there wasn't, but he was here, and for now that was the thing. He left. She put the check with the trust documents and went back to the bench. It was a Wednesday in late May, the kind of morning that makes you believe Ontario actually has a spring. Bet was arguing good-naturedly with Vince through the front window. A family from the church had come by with donated shoeboxes and were stacking them in the corner. Marlene had cleared for exactly that. The bell above the door gave its flat note, and a young woman came in carrying a girl on her hip. The girl was maybe 4 years old. She had one shoe on. The other foot was wrapped in a plastic bag held with a rubber band. The woman looked around the shop as if she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed to be in it. "Someone at the library told me to come here," she said. "That you help with." She glanced at her daughter's wrapped foot and then back at Marlene. "Her boot split at the seam yesterday. I can't, not this week." "You're in the right place," Marlene said. "Come sit down, let me see." She sat them in the 2 wooden chairs along the wall, the ones that had been there since Roy opened the door 40 years ago. She brought the girl a pair of clean socks from the basket she had started keeping by the door. Nobody had told her to. It had simply seemed right. She measured the small foot carefully, the way her father had, pressing the measuring guide flat against the floor and reading the size at the tip of the toe. She found a pair in the donation corner in under 10 minutes. Rain boots barely worn, the right size, bright yellow with small frogs on them. The girl stared at them the way small children stare at something that is for them, and that they did not expect. "Do you like frogs?" Marlene asked. The girl nodded very seriously. "Good," Marlene said. "Me too." She helped the girl put them on, and watched her stand up and look down at her own feet with the grave, complete satisfaction of someone who has just received something exactly right. The mother's eyes filled. She started to open her bag to ask about payment. Marlene shook her head. "That's not how this place works," she said. "You just have to need them, and everybody needs something sometimes." The woman nodded, and something in her shoulders came down, and she took her daughter's hand. They walked out into the May morning and down the street, and the girl looked at her feet every few steps, watching the yellow boots catch the light. Marlene stood in the doorway for a moment and watched them go. Then she went back inside to the bench, to the brown Oxford still waiting with one heel done and one to go. She picked up the tool. She held the shoe the way her father had held every shoe he had ever worked on, steadily as if it mattered because it did. She had come here 6 weeks ago to empty a dead man's shop and sell the fittings for scrap. She had found instead the shape of a life she had been living toward without knowing it. She finished the shoe. Outside on Main Street, the sign Vince had made from reclaimed barn tin caught the afternoon sun. "Callister's, open, everybody welcome." She left the light on,